Hey, History Seeking here, and today we'll take a walking tour at the medieval Bishop's Palace in Lincoln. The palace was once the administrative centre of the largest diocese in the medieval England, built in 1163 and one of the most impressive buildings in the country. Over the coming years, Bishop's Palace was rebuilt and fortified. Henry VIII and Queen Catherine Howard were entertained here in 1541. By 1945, the palace was regarded as too large for the bishop's requirements. It then became the diocese office and conference and retreat centre. In 1954, the site was placed in the guardianship of the Ministry of Works, which is now English heritage. The palace was originally approached from Christ Hospital's Terrace to the west and from the Cathedral Close to the east. The main western entrance was blocked before 1848. Originally, it led to a great courtyard in front of the West Hall. The entrance to the ruins today is the private entrance to the later medieval private apartments. The medieval Bishop's Palace is situated on a spectacular hillside behind Lincoln Cathedral. The palace offers extensive views over the city and countryside beyond. Lincoln was a major Roman city, and by the early 4th century had its own bishop. St Paulinus had built a church there in 627, and in 675 the bishopric of Lindsey was established, possibly centred on the city. In 1067, Remy of Fircamp, the first bishop created after the Norman conquest of 1066, moved the cathedral of his diocese from Dorchester-on-Thames to Lincoln, to complement the castle that was being built within the ruins of the Roman town, on top of the limestone ridge. This tower, built in the 1430s by Bishop Alnwick, linked his private rooms in the East Hall range with the public West Hall. The vaulted ground floor was a lobby between the West Hall and the Bishop's Chapel. All three surviving doors are medieval, and that on the north side is decorated with Alnwick's coat of arms, a black cross on a white background. The castle and cathedral were designed as symbols of Norman power, to express the authority of the crown and church on a conquered nation. Subsequent bishops seem to have lived outside the city or within the royal castle, as land for a palace of their own was not granted until 1135. Even then, it was not until the mid-12th century that Bishop Robert de Chesney started to build a residence for himself and his household on the present site. Bishop Alnwick's modernisation of the palace in the 1430s, including the building of a new chapel range, and now standing in the antechapel. In front of us, separated by a screen, was the chapel proper. Above, another floor containing the bishop's private pew, overlooking the chapel, could be reached from the bishop's bedchamber on the first floor of the Alnwick Tower. Below the chapel was Alnwick's audience chamber, containing at the far end an auditory or a small chapel where the bishop could pray in private. In 1155 to 1158, Bishop Robert de Chesney had the site regranted by Henry II and began building a new palace that was largely complete by 1163. After Bishop Chesney's death in 1166, the see was left vacant for many years, and it was during this vacancy that disaster struck Lincoln, when an earthquake destroyed the greater part of the cathedral and perhaps the palace. The East Hall block was built by Bishop St Hugh in the 1190s as the private part of the palace. His hall was on the first floor with his bedchamber, wardrobe and latrine beyond. His household had very similar rooms on the floor below, and the two halls were connected by a spiral staircase. The Bishop's Hall was elaborately decorated to emphasise the spiritual importance of the bishop. However, the ground floor hall was less lavishly decorated, in keeping with the busy lives of the bishop's household. In the 15th century, St Hugh's Great Hall was no longer fashionable. Bishop Alnwick inserted a floor at the top of the walls and converted the roof into a garret lodgings for his staff. The old ground floor hall became a cellar, and what remained of St Hugh's Hall became the bishop's private dining room. This is a bishop's audience chamber, described as a parlour in 1647. The room was lit from the south by 3 windows, including a sentry-placed oriel, which looked out over a small courtyard. The sight of a fireplace in its north wall towards the eastern end. In the west wall, between the 2 doors, is an elaborate buffet or sideboard. This is Alnwick's Private Auditory or small chapel, where the bishop could pray in private. It is covered by a curved barrel vault and lit by a single window in its south wall. The stone floor and altar below the window have disappeared, but otherwise the room is complete with a piscina for washing the communion vessels, cupboards in the west, north and east walls, and lamp brackets. A capable bishop was needed to restore Lincoln's fortune. Henry II's choice was a man he had personally brought to England to establish his Carthusian monastery of Witham in Somerset, Hugh of Avon. Hugh was appointed in 1186, the only Carthusian monk ever to become an English bishop. His time in Lincoln was marked by two major building campaigns: the total rebuilding of the bishop's palace and the rebuilding of the eastern arm of the damaged cathedral. On his death in 1200, only the East Hall range had been completed, though work on the West Hall range had begun. There was another pause in construction work, as the see was left vacant for 3 years before the appointment of William of Blois. William spent only 3 years in Lincoln, and it is not until 1209 that King John appointed Hugh of Wells. Bishop Hugh immediately fell out of favour for taking Archbishop Langton's side in John's quarrels with the Pope, and was forced into exile until 1213. Reconciled with the king, Hugh then supported Prince Louis of France, who was offered the crown on John's death in 1215, against the young Henry III. Louis invaded England, and it was at Lincoln that he was finally defeated in 1217, while besieging the castle. This would have been the toilet or the latrine. Hugh only retained his bishopric on payment of a large fine. In these circumstances, it is hardly surprising that work did not begin again at the palace until the 1220s. In 1223, Hugh of Wells was permitted to dig and take stone in the ditch of the city near his house, for the building of his house at Lincoln, and in the following year 40 great oaks were supplied from the Royal Forest of Sherwood for the roofing of his hall. As well as his work at the palace, Hugh completed St Hugh's choir and a transept, and began the rebuilding of the cathedral nave. He also built the chapter house, and is the first recorded builder of the palace at Buckenden. Hugh died in 1235 and was succeeded by Robert Grosseteste, who had been closely associated with him in his reform of the diocese. He completed the nave of the cathedral, rebuilt Hugh of Wells' central tower, which had collapsed in 1237 to 1239, and built the Gailey porch, the bishop's ceremonial entrance from the palace. Unfortunately, he died in 1253. The lower East Hall, the 12th century bishops' houses, were 2 stories high, with the bishop's hall and chamber at first floor level, and those of his household below. At Lincoln, the ground floor of St Hugh's house, built between 1186 and 1200, survives virtually intact, although later changes in ground level around it and the blocking of windows mean that it now appears more like a basement. The rooms at the south end follow the same plan on both floors: a large chamber, a wardrobe, the room where clothes were kept, and an elaborate latrine or guardrobe beyond it. The latrine was reused from Robert de Chasteney's buildings, which explains why it's a door halfway up the wall. The hall itself is in through the door on the left, 5 bays long and originally with tall lancet windows. Those on the west were blocked in the late 13th century. A fireplace introduced at the centre of the west wall in the early 14th century, and those on the east partly blocked when the courtyard level on that side was raised. The hall has doors in both sides. At each south end, on the level of the 15th century rebuilding, included a stairs from the kitchen courtyard. On the right, a spiral staircase led up to the bishop's hall on the floor above. At the far end of the hall is a well. This part of the East Hall range began to go out of use from the early 14th century, and by Bishop Alnwick's day, it was used largely for storage. Bishop Henry Burgundesh, Lord Chancellor of England, acquired a piece of land from the city to build a terrace garden in the 1320s. He was a great gardener, as the remains of the garden he created at his palaces of Netleham and Liddington still show. At Lincoln, he was able to take advantage of the hillside, which provided dramatic views over the city and surrounding countryside, while ensuring his own privacy. Bishop Henry's garden later became the kitchen garden of the late Victorian Bishop's Palace, and was more recently partially planted with vines from Lincoln's twin town of Neugenstadt de Weinstraße. In 2001, a new garden was created on Bishop Henry's Terrace, its design reflecting the architecture of the 12th and 13th century cathedral. The ribbing in cathedral roofs is reflected in Mark Walker's design of brickwork and stainless steel. Tall, thin trees give depth and perspective. The next documented work at the palace began in 1329, when Bishop Henry Burgish obtained a licence to fortify the palace and acquired the terrace on its south side. It was probably Burgish who built the new gatehouse on the east side of the palace, leading from the newly enclosed Cathedral Close, and who built the lodging range along the western boundary of the site that today forms the core of Edward King House. Burgish was a prolific builder, responsible for remodelling and crenelling the palaces of Linnington, Netleham and Stowe, and rebuilding the riverfront of Newark Castle. The Bishop's Palace then remained little changed until the second quarter of the 15th century, when Bishop William Alnwick, from 1436 to 1439, brought its buildings up to date. Alnwick, who had been a prolific builder, as Bishop of Norwich, was responsible for building the new gatehouse tower at the north end of the east and west halls that bear his name, and a chapel and audience chamber range at the north end of the chapel courtyard, designed to provide an impressive approach to his private apartments from Burgesh's New Gate. We are now standing in the kitchen Undercroft, built so that the kitchen above would be on the same level as the West Hall. This stone-vaulted chamber was used as a brew house, where all the beer drunk in the palace was prepared, and nearby stood the bakehouse. Each member of the bishop's household was provided with 7 pints of beer and 2 pounds of bread a day, as well as their meals in the hall. Meals were prepared in the kitchen above, and if we look up you will see the tiled fire backs of 5 huge fireplaces. On these fireplaces great cauldrons were boiled and whole carcasses roasted to feed the bishop, his household and his guests on feast days. The kitchen's external walls were decorated with blank arcades. Windows were set within 2 western arches, and the single ones on the east side. The Undercroft was entered through a door at the central of its north wall. Externally, this door is very grand, because the Undercroft lay on the south side of the passage, to the great courtyard west of the hall. The south wall was reused from Robert de Chesney's palace, and retained 2 of his lancet windows. Apart from the vault, which was replaced in the 1220s, the Undercroft remained substantially intact. The close association between Bishop John Longland and Henry VIII made the palace a prime target during the Lincolnshire Rising of 1536. Although the rebels entered it, the extent of the damage is unknown. Whatever it was, repairs must have been carried out by 1541, when Henry VIII and Queen Catherine Howard were entertained in the palace, where one of the alleged indiscretions that led to the Queen's execution took place. The public hall of the palace, where the bishop would entertain or conduct public business, was begun by St Hugh in the 1190s, but only completed by Bishop Hugh Wells in 1224. One of the finest style halls in medieval England, it was intended to demonstrate the power and importance of the bishop as a prince of the church. Updated by Bishop Alnwick, who added a great oriel window. This is the hall in which Bishop John Longland entertained Henry VIII and Queen Catherine Howard in 1541. After 1547, when the bishop moved to Netleham, it was rarely used at all. Destroyed during the Civil War, the West Hall became a paddock in the 1650s. Its porch was turned into a coach house and a stable built along its west wall. In the 1880s, the chapel of the new bishop's palace was built in the ruins of the buttery and pantry at the south end of the west wall. In March 1617, James I visited Lincoln for 9 days and was entertained to a banquet in the palace after a service in the cathedral on the 31st of March. However, the king and his party were lodged elsewhere. Bishop John Williams began repairs to the palace in 1625 to 1628, in part using materials from Netleham, which by then had been abandoned. These repairs and additions were to include a library continued throughout the 1630s, even though Bishop Williams resided principally at Buckden. The work was never finished, however, the repairs being overtaken by the onset of civil war. The tower contains 2 rooms, reached by a stair from the West Hall. On the first floor was the bishop's privy chamber or bedroom, with an oriel window looking out towards the cathedral and a fireplace in the wall opposite. The blocked door to the left of the fireplace led to a short passage, off which was a latrine to the bishop's pew at the west end of his private chapel. The room on the upper floor of the tower, also with a wall fireplace, was probably for the bishop's chaplain. A short passage from the stair led to the parapet gutter of the West Hall. The tower was restored in 1876 by Bishop Wilberforce to provide lecture rooms for his theological college. If you look closely in parts of the building, you can see they've been scorched red by fire, apparently that of 1648. Thank you all for watching. If you do enjoy our videos, please consider subscribing. Hit the notification bell to be notified of our next video, and hit the thumbs up and maybe leave us a comment. Do take care and have a fantastic week ahead.